My name is Rachel Monroe, and for 15 years, people only saw me as Richard Vanderbilt's wife. He was one of the most powerful businessmen in the country. But there was more to my story. I met Richard in college while we were both studying business. I was ambitious and wanted to build my own company. Richard, however, came from a wealthy family and already had a job waiting for him at his father's business. We fell in love, or at least, I thought we did. After graduation, Richard asked me to marry him, but there was a catch. He wanted me to give up my dreams and be the perfect wife. My wife doesn't need to work, he said. I'll take care of everything. Back then, I was young and believed him. I thought I would have everything I needed, so I agreed. Our wedding was huge, covered in magazines. I played the role of the perfect wife, attending events and supporting Richard's image. But I never gave up on my dreams. While Richard was busy at work, I started my own company, Northway Technologies. In secret, I used my inheritance money and ran everything from our mansion's garage. To stay hidden, I hired a CEO to be the face of the company while I worked in the background. For 10 years, I built my empire quietly, at fancy dinners. When Richard mocked me for being just a housewife, I only smiled because my company was growing bigger than his. Then I met Valerie. She was Richard's new assistant. One night, during dinner, Richard kept praising her. "She's brilliant, Rachel. She works late with me almost every night," he said. That's when I saw it, the way they looked at each other. How she laughed too easily at his jokes. I knew something was going on. I hired a private investigator. And I was right. Richard and Valerie were having an affair. But there was more. Richard was planning to divorce me. "She's young and smart," he told a colleague. "Not like Rachel. She's done nothing with her life." He had no idea I was running a multi-million-dollar company. I also found out his business was in serious trouble. They were losing money and would soon need a buyer. That's when I made my move. Through secret companies, I started buying shares of Richard's company. At the same time, I spread rumors about its financial problems. Investors panicked, and the company's stock price crashed. One evening, Richard came home angry. He threw his briefcase and ran his hands through his hair, completely frustrated. "Everything is falling apart," he yelled. "And the worst part? Northway Technologies is buying all our shares." I stood there, feeling the weight of his words. He had no idea that the person destroying his company was me. But I didn't react. I walked to the bar and poured him a glass of his favorite whiskey. My movements steady and calm, unlike him. I made sure not to show any sign of satisfaction, even though I had expected this moment. "Oh, darling, that's awful," I said softly, keeping my face composed. I handed him the glass, offering it like a peace token, though my mind was far from peaceful. "Who even owns Northway Technologies?" he snapped, frustration boiling over. "They came out of nowhere. No one knows who's behind it. None of this makes sense." He ran a hand through his hair again, growing more agitated. I stepped back, watching him carefully as he unraveled before me. "It's all very mysterious, isn't it?" I said, my voice cool. "But business is full of surprises, Richard. You should know that by now." He didn't reply right away. Instead, he stared at his whiskey as if it held the answers he desperately needed. His frustration was clear, his whole world was slipping away. 2 weeks later, he came home early again. But this time, he was different. There was no hesitation, no doubt. He walked in as if he had already made his decision, as if nothing could stop him. And beside him, standing too close, was Valerie. "Rachel, we need to talk," he said, his voice cold, a smug smile on his lips, like he had one. "Valerie and I are getting married." I didn't flinch. I stayed seated, calm, my expression unreadable. I had seen that smug look before, the one he wore when he thought he was in control. "I've already talked to my lawyers," he continued, his tone full of arrogance. "I'll give you a decent alimony, but you have to leave the house. After all, you've never worked a day in your life." Beside him, Valerie smirked, her eyes shining with victory. She stepped closer, her confidence obvious. "Richard needs a woman who understands business," she said, her voice sharp, "not just a simple housewife." Their presence felt suffocating. But I simply tilted my head and met Richard's gaze. "How much time do I have to leave?" I asked, my voice calm, almost bored. Valerie laughed, mocking me. "You're pathetic. You're not even going to fight?" "Until tomorrow," Richard cut in, his voice firm. "The lawyers will be here in the morning with the divorce papers." I let out a slow breath, standing up and smoothing an invisible wrinkle on my dress. "All right," I said, my voice steady, "but before I go, don't you want to know who bought Vanderbilt Corp?" Richard scoffed, annoyed. "And how would you know anything about that?" I smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "You may be losing everything, but there's one thing you can't take from me, what I built in secret, and this is just the beginning." Without another word, I pulled out my phone and made a call. My voice was calm, firm. "James, could you come in? It's time." 5 minutes later, the doorbell rang. Richard, still trying to keep his composure, frowned but went to answer it. Standing at the door, in a perfectly tailored suit, was James, the public CEO of Northway Technologies, along with a team of sharp-looking lawyers. "Mr. Vanderbilt," James greeted him coolly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Let me introduce you to the true owner and founder of Northway Technologies, your wife, Rachel Monroe." Richard's face turned pale. His eyes widened. For the first time in years, he was speechless. Beside him, Valerie's designer handbag slipped from her fingers, hitting the floor with a soft thud. Her shocked expression mirrored his. This is impossible," Richard stammered, his voice hoarse, as if refusing to believe the truth. James didn't blink. He opened his briefcase, moving slowly and deliberately. "I assure you, Mr. Vanderbilt, it's very real. Northway Technologies now owns 76% of Vanderbilt Corp's shares. That makes Mrs. Monroe your boss." The words hit like a balm. Valerie let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh. "You're lying. She's just a housewife." I stepped forward, standing taller, no longer playing the obedient wife. "A simple housewife?" I echoed, smirking. "While you were busy having an affair, I was building a $3 billion tech empire." I lowered my voice, taunting. "Tell me, Valerie, who's pathetic now?" Richard, who had been so smug moments ago, sank onto the sofa, his face twisted in shock. He looked like a man who had just realized his entire world was crumbling. "As for the divorce papers," I continued, gesturing toward a neat stack on the table, "they're ready. My terms are simple: I keep Northway Technologies, Vanderbilt Corp, and this house. You get your mistress and just enough money to rent a small apartment." Richard's silence only lasted a few seconds before his arrogance flared back. He stood, shaking off the shock. "You can't do this," he snapped, his voice filled with panic. I met his gaze, completely unfazed. "Your father built this company," I said calmly. "And you? You ran it into the ground." I tilted my head slightly, letting my words sink in. "Do you really want the world to know how you stole company funds to fund your luxury lifestyle with Valerie?" "Because I have everything: emails, bank transfers, every illegal transaction." Valerie's confidence shattered in an instant. She took a step back, her face full of fear. "Richard, sweetheart, we have to go," she whispered, her voice shaking. I let out a small, amused breath. "Leaving already?" I asked, pretending to be disappointed. But we were just getting started. I let the silence grow before delivering the final blow. "Oh, and Valerie, did you know Richard was paying your assistant's salary using money stolen from the employee's pension fund?" Valerie's eyes widened in horror. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. You used stolen money to pay me? Valerie whispered, her voice trembling with panic. I can explain, Richard stammered, reaching out to her. But she pulled away, shaking her head, as if trying to distance herself from the disaster unfolding in front of her. I let the silence stretch, the weight of it pressing down on the room. Then, with a small nod toward the documents on the table, I said, "The divorce papers are right here." I tapped the stack lightly. "Sign them now, and we keep all of this between us. Refuse, and by tomorrow morning, every major newspaper will be running a front-page story on Vanderbilt Corp's corruption and its downfall." Richard's eyes darted to the papers, then back to me. His hands trembled as he reached for the pen. The room was silent as he scribbled his signature, a man who had spent his life in control, now reduced to nothing. As he stood to leave, I added one final blow. "Oh, and one more thing." I smiled, savoring the moment. "Your father called me this morning. He's impressed with how Northway Technologies handled the takeover. He asked me to personally take over the company he built." I leaned in slightly, my voice soft but sharp. "Looks like he's finally getting the executive daughter-in-law he always wanted." Richard stood frozen, unable to respond. His world had collapsed, and he knew it. As he and Valerie packed their belongings, preparing to leave what was once their home, I received an unexpected visitor. Gladys, Richard's mother. She walked in with quiet authority, her sharp eyes studying me like she was seeing me for the first time. Without a word, she sat down across from me, crossing her legs elegantly. "I always knew you were more than you let on," she said calmly. "The way you observed everything. How you handled social events. How you knew when to speak and when to stay silent. A simple housewife doesn't have that kind of strategic mind." I met her gaze, intrigued but silent, letting her continue. She tilted her head, as if piecing together a long unfinished puzzle. "Why did you never say anything?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "Why let everyone believe you were just Richard's obedient wife?" I exhaled softly, a knowing smile playing on my lips. "Because I knew I had to wait for the right moment." I replied calmly, my words heavy with meaning. Gladys X smiled slowly, her eyes almost approving. "Richard inherited his father's wealth," she said, settling into her chair. "But he never inherited his business smarts. The company needed fresh blood." She paused, her gaze sharp. "And that's why I'm here, Rachel." She pulled a thick envelope from her purse and placed it on the table. Curious, I opened it carefully and pulled out a stack of old photographs. The images were worn, black and white shots of the company's early days. One showed the tiny, cramped office downtown, the humble beginning of what had grown into a massive empire. "My husband built this from nothing," Gladys said, her tone proud and nostalgic. "He worked hard, used his intelligence, just like you. If he were alive today, he'd be proud to see his legacy in your hands." Her words lingered, like she was passing on the torch. The company, the legacy, the empire, they were mine now. It wasn't just about proving something to Richard. It was about owning what I had built and continuing that legacy, no matter how others saw me. The following months were a blur of decisions, negotiations, and strategies. I merged Northway Technologies with Vanderbilt Corp, creating one of the most innovative companies in the country. I implemented new policies, hiring women for executive roles, promoting gender equality, and funding female entrepreneurs. The company became more than just a business. It was a movement. Richard, of course, didn't take it well. He tried suing me, but it was pointless. His case had no chance, especially with all the evidence of his embezzlement. His lawyers, who had likely been on his payroll, advised him to accept the settlement and avoid a public scandal. Valerie left him shortly after. Once the money dried up, she had no reason to stay. Last I heard, Richard was working at a small company, trying to rebuild his career, while Valerie moved on to her next target. But none of it was about revenge. That was just a side effect. The real victory was proving that you should never underestimate someone based on appearances, that success doesn't always fit society's narrow mold. For years, I'd been underestimated. Now, I was standing tall, more powerful than anyone ever imagined. 5 years later, I found myself on the cover of Forbes, named one of the most successful CEOs in the country. They called me the silent queen of tech, recognizing how I had quietly built my empire while the world saw me as just another housewife with no real ambitions. But what they didn't realize was that the true revenge had never been about wealth or proving people wrong. It was about doing everything on my terms, with grace and intelligence. It was about creating something lasting that spoke louder than any words ever could. Last week, I opened the Rachel Monroe Center for Women Entrepreneurs. During the event, a young woman approached me, asking how she could overcome the discrimination she faced in her own career. Her eyes were filled with hope as she asked, "What advice would you give to others like me, facing this every day?" I smiled, reflecting on everything I had been through, and said, "Don't let anyone define your limits. And remember, sometimes the best time to build your empire is when no one is watching." In my office, I have a framed photo from that dinner when Richard first introduced me to Valerie. They thought I was just a meek, quiet woman, playing my part. In the photo, I'm smiling politely while they exchange smug glances, thinking they had me figured out. I keep that photo as a reminder every obstacle is an opportunity. The best revenge isn't revenge at all, it's success. And to anyone who's been underestimated or overlooked, your time will come. Just make sure you're ready when it does. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, like the video and subscribe to our channel. This is where justice always finds its way. See you next time.